In this video, we'll see how to connect and use Microsoft SQL Server for this class. But first, let's review some basics about relational database. We already learned about relational database in other classes like CS 1222. Basically, relational databases organize data in tables. For example, this could be a database at a company for keeping track of the information about the employees and the projects they work on. The employee information would be in the employees table. The project information will be in the projects table. And the project members table keeps track of which employee is working on which project. This diagram shows the big picture view of a database system. First, we have the Database Management System, or DBMS. DBMS is a software that manages the data, and there are many such software. You probably heard of commercial DBMS like Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server, which we'll be using in this class. In some other classes, you'll probably use open source DBMS software like MySQL and PostgreSQL. A DBMS software typically manages many databases. For example, everyone in this class has their own database, and all these databases are managed by a single DBMS server. A database contains data. As we just mentioned, in a relational database, the data is organized in tables. In addition to tables, database usually also includes additional functions and data structures like indexes. These are usually called database objects or schema elements. One thing you may or may not be aware is that between tables and the databases, there's often another layer called schema. Schema is like namespace in C# or package in Java. It helps to group related database objects together and to create boundaries with other database objects for design and security reasons. When we use tables in Microsoft SQL Server, we can include schema name, like, for example, like this. We would say schema name dot table name. So this is like the full name of a table. If we don't specify the schema name, the system will assume the table is in the default schema called DBO, which stands for Database Owner. Here's a little bit more terminology. In relational database, tables are often also called relations. Tables, of course, have rows and columns. Columns are also called attributes or fields, and the rows are also called records or tuples or tuples. I use this term interchangeably, so please don't get confused. And then when we talk about database design, we often say design the schema of the database. The word schema here has a different meaning than the one we just mentioned here. In this context, it refers to the structure of the database, like what tables are in the database and what columns are in each table. It's basically the design of the database before we put any data into it. Virtually all DBMS systems use a client-server architecture, maybe with the exception of Microsoft Access. But anyway, most DBMS has separate server software and client software. The server software is responsible for managing the databases, and we can use some client software to connect to the server and access the data. In the case of Microsoft SQL Server for this class, we already set up a server for you, so you just need to use some client software to connect to it. If you use Windows, I would recommend using SQL Server Management Studio, aka SSMS. If you use Mac or Linux, you can use Azure Data Studio. And if you are comfortable with command line, you can try SQL command. And later, we'll develop applications that talk to a database. And those applications are also considered database clients. Regardless of what DBMS software you use, when you try to connect to a database server, you'll likely need these 5 pieces of information. Host is the host name or IP address of the server that hosts the databases. Port is the port number the database server software uses. Your account username and password authenticate you to the database server. And then you also need the name of the database you access. For this class, I already installed Microsoft SQL Server software on the school server ca3.calstatela.edu. It uses the default port number 1433, so when you connect to it, you can omit the port number. You should already got an email with your username and password in it. The database assigned to you has the same name as your database account. For example, if your database account is CS4540STU some number like 31, then the database assigned to you is also has the same name CS4540STU31, same as your account username. Now let's see how to connect to the database server using SQL Server Management Studio. So the server type should be database engine. It's a drop-down list. You should select database engine if it's not already selected. The server name is ca3.calstatela.edu, and authentication is also a drop-down list. We would want to select SQL Server authentication, and then your username and password. So once we connect it, we can see on the left-hand side there are bunch of items like databases, security, server objects, and so on. If we expand databases, we can see that this server is managing quite a few databases. Now, if you try to click on any database that's not assigned to you, you should get an error message like this that says this database is not accessible because you are not allowed to access a database. Now, I'm a student 33, so this is my database. If I click on it, it expands without giving an error message. Now, later on, we'll use this interface to run SQL statements. The way to do that is to click the New Query button. It will open up an editor. We can then write SQL statements in it. Although it's called New Query, it actually accepts any SQL statements. For example, we can do create table, test, ID int, name, varchar, and so on and so forth. We can do select star from test and so on. So SQL statements here. Now, one thing you want to make sure is that your database is selected in this drop-down list. If it's not selected, you would want to select your database here. Otherwise, when you run your SQL statements, you will get an error that says you cannot run it in this database or something like that. So this is for SQL Server Management Studio, and let me see if I Yes, I did install Azure Data Studio on this computer too. So let's try the same thing here. And here we'll start with a new connection. And the connection type is Microsoft SQL Server. And the server is at cs3.custody.la.edu. Authentication type, again, choose SQL login, not Windows authentication or Azure Active Directory. It should be SQL login, meaning that the SQL server will authenticate the user instead of using something else. And oh, I think I forgot my password. It's a randomly generated password, rather complex. I didn't remember it. So anyway, after you log in, you'll see this interface, the one below. So unlike SQL Server Management Studio, the new query button and the SQL editor are on different windows. So you would need to first click New Query, and then it will show this window, and you can then write SQL statements in the editor. And similar to SQL Management Studio, you'll need to select your database in this drop-down list. Again, if you select the wrong database, it won't let you to run your SQL statements. So that's pretty much it, how we can connect to SQL Server. And in the next video, we'll briefly review SQL. So thanks, and see you in the next video.